Hi, my name is Ariel Cohen, and today I'm going to be discussing my study called ASL Acquisition in Autism Spectrum Disorder over 7 years, a longitudinal study. And to let you know, I will be following a PowerPoint along the way, which will get submitted with the video. So first, to begin with the background, why do a longitudinal study in the first place? Well, in order to look at language acquisition, development, and overall proficiency, it's really important to look at progress and how it's going to change over time. So instead of looking at one screenshot in time, it's really important to look at the progress and how it's going to change over time in order to see how that proficiency will grow or not grow. Next, to talk about autism spectrum disorder. There are 5 criterion according to the DSM-5. First, deficits in social communication. Second, restricted and repetitive behaviors and interests. Third, symptoms in early developmental period. Fourth, clinically significant impairments in adaptive functioning. And lastly, disturbances that are not better explained by intellectual disability. So as the name autism spectrum disorder states, it's a spectrum disorder, so we see a wide range of severities in our symptoms. 20 to 30% of our population have no functional language, where really high functioning individuals can actually communicate with their peers in social settings but have a more difficult time than their typically developing peers. Another thing is that it's a neurodevelopmental disorder. What this means is that we know that there are genetic underpinnings to this disorder, and although we've made some large discoveries in recent years, a lot of researchers such as Dr. Losh will look at endophenotypes instead because it sort of breaks down the disorder because we don't have one specific genetic underpinning at the time. One last thing is that there is a characteristic pragmatic language impairment in autism spectrum disorder. So these individuals have a really difficult time communicating in social contexts, as the DSM-5 criterion sort of states. Next, American Sign Language. Why do we study it? Well, it's an alternative mode of communication, and we actually see similar development and acquisition in ASL as we see in oral language. And I think there's a lot of misconception in society about whether or not this is a real language, and the truth is that it is. We see babbling stages, we see combinational speech in the beginning, things like this. So it's really important to note that there are complex layers and levels to this language, just as there are in oral language. Another thing is that it's commonly taught to deaf individuals and their relatives. So you won't necessarily see a hearing person who belongs to a hearing family know ASL unless they seek it out themselves. So we sort of see that it belongs to a niche of people. Lastly, there are non-manual markers that convey meaning according to Belushi and Fisher in 1972. So things like facial expression and place of articulation are important in order to convey meaning. So girl is going to be on the chin and boy is on the forehead. Anything that has to do with male or boy is on the top half. Anything female and girl related on the bottom half of the face. What is my hypothesis for the study? I predict that high-functioning ASD children beginning to learn ASL at age 5 will be able to acquire some American Sign Language by age 12, but not achieve 100% proficiency. Because ASD individuals display a characteristic impairment in pragmatics, and ASL requires a register of facial expressions to convey meaning. What are the methods of the study? I'm going to recruit 5-year-olds with an ASD diagnosis, and all of the 5-year-olds will have a diagnosis from the Center for Autism and Related Disorders in Chicago, Illinois, and that is to control for all diagnostic differences that we see in the field today. I'm recruiting 30 children and going to split them into 2 equal groups of 15. The first in a high-functioning ASL group and the second in a high-functioning standard English group. The standard English group from ages 5 to 12 is going to receive normal English input as they normally would. There is no special treatment. This is our control group. The 15 in the high-functioning ASL group will be receiving that same English input, that oral language input as they normally would. However, they're also going to be receiving ASL input at home from their parents, and those parents will be trained on ASL before the research study begins. The assessments. All assessments will be done to control for it in the Northwestern Neurodevelopmental Disabilities Lab with Dr. Losh. We will do an annual check-in at age 5 and every year after that until age 12. So it's an annual check-in, and both groups will receive 2 assessments. The first, the Sign Language Proficiency Interview, or SLPI, which is an interview between an interviewer and the child, and the interview content is reviewed for vocabulary, production, fluency, grammar, and comprehension skills. So essentially, overall proficiency in ASL. The second assessment is called Comprehensive Assessment of Spoken Language, or CASL, and this is an oral assessment tool, and it looks at 4 categories of proficiency: lexical, semantic, syntactic, superlinguistic, and pragmatic. So again, this is just another measure of oral language proficiency in English. What are the anticipated results and why? So the general trends I expect to see is that high-functioning ASL will have improved English over time. But because they're receiving input of oral language in English and ASL input from their parents at home, their English may not improve as much as the high-functioning standard English group, because that group, the standard English group, will not be teasing through two different languages and processing two languages. They're only going to be receiving English over time. That's because there are controls. I also expect in the high-functioning ASL group that there will be acquisition in ASL. And according to the Edward G. Carr study, they predict that noun and request information will be learned first. Similar to what we see in oral language in English, we're generally going to learn objects and people's names first, as well as requesting things such as food or baba. But they will have difficulty with the generative and creative aspects of language, so generating those new and original syntactic structures. So why do I expect this? So first, I read a lot of literature on this, and like I said, the Edward G. Carr study predicted that noun and request information. Secondly, you cannot learn language without the proper input, and that's why the standard English group is not going to be learning any ASL acquisition, for example. And we talked about this a lot in Dr. Norton's lecture. Lastly, English proficiency improves more for the standard English group, and again, the reason is because there's not conflicting input and there's no processing of two different languages. They are strictly hearing English language. The next slide in the presentation is going to show just a graphic representation of what I just described, so you guys will see that in the submission and the discussion. ASL proficiency is going to depend on a variety of factors. First, input and exposure, quality input, and the amount of input. So the more input you're receiving, the bigger chance you have of sort of succeeding and having higher proficiency with the language later on. Another part of that is having opportunities to practice. So it's really important to get that input and that exposure and really high quality at that, but it's important that the children are given opportunities to exercise that ASL at home, for example, for that ASL group. And lastly, start age. The sooner we can start language acquisition, the better. Of course, we're limited by the age of diagnosis we receive for autism at this time, so if we have tools to assess and to find autism earlier on, it may be beneficial for learning ASL. And what is better for autism, standard English or ASL? Well, it's difficult to answer this question because we only looked at ASL input from parents at home, so we would need to do a follow-up study and to sort of see if more input would be better, but we have to also look at this isolation factor. Like we saw in Sound and Fury, is it a good idea to make them belong to this one particular community or not? Thank you.